Good morning and welcome to ATARC's Identity and Access Management Virtual Summit. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Alyssa Cole and I'm the event manager here at ATARC, and I will be emceeing today's summit. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and ATARC is a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. Thank you to our partners over at Ping Identity for helping us to create today's summit. Truly some great partners for us here at ATARC. Additionally, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoy this great and informative day. We'd also like you to be reminded that after each panel, there'll be a time for Q&A, so please place all your questions that you have in the Q&A box on your screen. During the panels, the moderators will ask our amazing speakers some. I also wanted to remind you that you'll also be asked poll questions throughout the panels so that you'll be eligible for CP credits. Up first, I'd like to introduce our visionary keynote, Jerry Karen. Jerry is the Chief Information Officer and Assistant Inspector General for the Office of the Inspector General in HHS. Jerry, please take it away.
Good morning. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me. As always, always happy to participate in ATARC events. Today's subject, identity. What haven't you heard or what haven't been said about identity? Yet we keep talking about it and we keep trying to address it. You know, right data to the right people at the right time, getting authoritative identities. Yet it still seems to be a lot of work that we have to do, and mainly because we are still working on transitioning, I believe, legacy applications with identities themselves and things like that. So, but basically we got to concentrate on getting the right data to the right people at the right time, and we're creating more data than ever before, and we depend on that data. And also we have malicious actions like phishing attacks, people trying to spoof identities, and there's so much to deal with in this world. We could go on forever. However, they only gave me 15 minutes. But identity is one of the 5 pillars in Zero Trust, and it's very important that it work with all the other pillars as well. A lot of people start with the identity pillar when they're approaching Zero Trust, which is fine. And you start where you need, depending on what your capabilities currently are. So identity is getting, you know, we're only one human being, yet we have multiple digital identities. If I just look on my phone, I have identities for all my different applications, banks, bills, all these things, and I have these different identities. But federating those identities is important. Getting back to make sure that we have that one human, how we proof them. The great thing the federal government does is, you know, is allowed the adoption of FIDO 2. So there's some great things that can be happening around this area, and the technology is getting even better all the time to help with these areas. However, like I said, we're dealing with legacy applications. Also, a lot of us rely on things like Active Directory. And how many times have you tried to look at group membership and seen all the nested groups? And I've actually seen it where nested group was nested within itself. It was nested so many times. And so breaking through that definitely is a task. And so it is no easy feat. I've heard General Skinner talk about, you know, life after CAC, or the replacement for CAC. That's something definitely I know the DoD is looking at. So what's the next thing? Yet a lot of the concepts we talk about all the time, least privilege, you know, we have administrators who have multiple identities due to their job. So we want to make sure that they have least privilege. We want to eliminate the buddy system. We want to be able to automate as much as possible. So I think going forward, while it's easy to talk about, the practice of putting it in place sometimes can be a little more difficult depending on your situation. One thing I did want to mention, though, is about the Zero Trust Lab that we have here at ATARC. I wanted to make sure that I put a plug in for that. We are about to begin what I call phase 2. Phase 1 has basically been 60 or so vendors giving individual presentations of their zero trust. A lot of those fall within the identity pillar, as a matter of fact. They've all been recorded. They're on ATARC's YouTube channel. They've all been recorded so people can go back and look at them. So we've gone through all these 60 plus vendors and doing their individual presentations of how they fit into the zero trust model. Next, phase 2, we will be going and doing use cases based on integrated labs. So we're asking integrators or vendors to partner and come in and create a complete lab of zero trust. Really looking forward to that. I think Thursday we're having the kickoff with the vendors to go over those use cases, to review them, get some feedback that the government's developed. So we're really looking forward to that around the October, November timeframe. I would expect some of these labs to be built. The presentations for those, although the presentations for the individual ones have been open to all government and vendors and those that want to see them. However, the phase 2 labs will be closed to be presented to the government only. So we're really looking forward to that. It's been some great work and some great insights and some great products introduced through phase 1. But in phase 2, we really want to see that integration. How does identity work with the network pillar? How does it work with the application pillar? All of those types of things. So really looking forward to that coming up very soon. So Alyssa, unless there's any questions from anybody in the audience, that was my short and sweet for the day.
Sounds good. Well, thank you for the lab plug. If anyone is interested, we're more than welcome to, or we're more than happy to point you in the right direction for that. I believe you are on the next panel, so I'll just have you stay on. But for that, we do have Tom Temin moderating. So Tom, I'll have you hop on, and then Brian is also going to be on this panel. So I will turn it over to you, gentlemen.
Okay, thank you very much. And Jerry, I want to say that your short and sweet is better than most people's long and sour. So we're glad to have you with whatever you say. And our other panelist today is Brian Rosenstiel, whom I met yesterday on a earlier Zoom call. And he is running the federal programs basically for Ping Identity. He's the CTO there and so on. And I want to tell you, I was impressed by how much Brian knows about the details of technical architectures for this whole thing and the way that zero trust and identities are interrelated, identity management. So we've got a lot of questions, and we'll take questions from the audience. And I guess, Alyssa, remind me how I'll be seeing those. We'll see those in the chat, I guess, but we'll make sure that your questions get answered.
They'll be down in the Q&A box.
Q&A box. Okay, lots of boxes here, but I see there's 56 of you tuning in. And so I guess nobody has anything better to do on a gorgeous August afternoon or August morning. So this is a good place to be. And I wanted to start off the discussion with something, Jerry, that you said very early in your talk, and that is the authoritative identity, the original thing that is needed that touches off everything else that happens when we enroll people, identify them, authorize them, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to have you both answer this, but it seems like the authoritative identity that originates all of this is really the foundation stone for zero trust, let alone identity management. Am I correct in that? And what are the ways we're ensuring the original is authoritative? And Jerry, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so we have so many ways to authenticate, Tom. The way I look at it is how confident am I in the proofing of Tom, whether he did it with a cat card, whether he did it with the username and password. There's different levels of risk to those. So when I come up with my confidence scores, how much do I trust that? A cat card or a PIV card is going to have probably a lower risk than your username and password or some other methods of authentication. So I kind of look at it that way. So that will depend on what I'm going to allow you to do. However, you are one human being, and we have a proliferation of digital identities throughout our network. From applications have their ways of authenticating, especially if they're not single sign-on. But you still have an identity there. So tying that together to the one human being Tom, and how confident am I that when Tom presents his credentials in whatever fashion to authenticate, what level of trust do I have, depending on what you're trying to access as well. So what is the target that you're trying to access? Is that just the cafeteria menu? Well, okay, I'll probably let you read that. Probably not going to let you edit it. But if it's medical records, probably not going to let you use username and password. I'm probably going to make you use a PIV card or a CAT card of some sort. But being able to corral or herd the cats of all these digital identities, I think is very important. So you can have that authoritative. And then once you get to that authoritative identity, you can start looking at the automation of the provisioning and the deprovisioning and all the lifecycle changes that happen. So that if Tom moves from one office to another within the same organization, there's still things that you shouldn't have access to anymore, and they're birthright things that you should get. So having that tied into that authoritative identity will make and help that automation and provisioning, deprovisioning, and things much better, and more able to implement those things to me.
So you would want birthright access, say, to your ever shrinking TSP, for example.
Yes. Yes. And I looked up my quarterly statement yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah, we won't go there this morning. I
No.
don't dare look at what's going on with mine.
No, you don't want to see a grown man cry this early.
And Brian, what about the issue of even a step higher in the chain or prior in the chain of the CAT card, and that is avoiding the what I call the catch me if you can syndrome, that someone is not who they say they are in the first place when they first join the government before they get the PIV card. What are some best practices there?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, the nice thing with the CAC and the PIV, you know, and to kind of echo this authoritative identity, which, you know, absolutely, completely agree with the importance around, right? So we'll pick on the CAC and the PIV and smart cards in general, in a very fun way, because it's an incredibly strong authenticator. There are very few authenticators. In fact, I can't think of authenticator off the top of my head that works better at enterprise scale while still maintaining an incredible amount of security. But the only thing it tells you is proof of possession of private key. So if I have a smart card issued from a CA that I can validate, only thing it tells me is that I've got that corresponding private key and I know how to unlock it. That is actually not security. The security of the CAC and the PIV, in my opinion, comes from all the processes it takes to get that card. Right, so I'll just take a time, go through it really, really fast, right? So it starts with background investigations, you know, fingerprint analysis that goes through it. You have to, you know, show up in person in order to be able to be issued that initial card. That initial card comes from a certain card stock, right? You can't just go out on Amazon and buy a smart card and enroll it with certificates. Those certificates come from very specific, you know, certificate authorities. I spent, you know, fair bit of my career actually in those, you know, PKI hamster cages, helping to protect those systems. It was a lot of fun. I still miss that I didn't have a giant water bottle to drink out of, but you know, well, maybe one day. But the point is that all of these
little metal tube coming down.
That's right. That's exactly. All of those things go into everything up until the point that you actually get those certificates minted on that card. You know, right? That the goal is to make that as transparent as possible to the user, and that's where the confidence of those credentials come from. So that's why we trust those credentials. That's why we continue to see those credentials persist and you know, stay relevant and in use even 2 decades after some of those cards were initially implemented. And it's why, you know, we have to be able to understand that model as we look to other types of authenticators that are in, you know, I don't want to say more modern format, right? Because the PIV card today looks nothing like the PIV card of, you know, 20 years ago. There's a lot of different security enhancements and everything that have gone into that card. But as we look at different types of form factors that work better with mobile devices and things like that, we need to keep in mind, this is why the CAC and the PIV have lasted for 2 decades. Let's not forget that, and let's make sure that we're following that model moving forward.
All right. And Jerry, just to conclude the thinking on that particular topic, does the community that cares about the sanctity of the CAC and the PIV card, do you look at form factors? Do you look and somehow monitor it periodically to make sure that it really is the state of the art, because it has been so enduring for these couple of decades?
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with all of Brian's points and couldn't have said it better. And that's why he's the expert there, definitely. But yeah, I mean, he brought up the form factors too. I can't take my mobile phone and I can't put my PIV in it. And there's the talk of derived credentials, but I haven't looked at it for a couple of years from a technology standpoint. But true derived credentials is something that has been a little challenging, to say the least. That's why other forms of authentication, I think some organizations have gone with, whether it be multi-factor through an authenticator and things like that for the mobile phone. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier is, yeah, you have these different ways of authenticating. So there's a different confidence that you have what you're going to allow to do or not. But definitely the PIV card, where it can be used, is something that we do first and foremost. The laptop that I'm talking to you on today has a PIV card slot in it. I don't have a dongle plugged into it, but it has a built-in PIV card slot because that's what we primarily want to use. That's primarily what we used for single sign-on for some of our other applications, the ones that we federated and things. So it definitely has an enduring and long-lasting lifespan to it right now. But however, the other form factors of the mobile phones and things like that have made it a little challenging, where we've had to look for other alternatives to a PIV card, because it's going to look kind of funny me working down the street with a dongle hanging off my mobile phone while I'm talking and looking at my TikTok for the latest dance. Look kind of
Sure.
silly.
Yes, I remember seeing a general officer in the military about 30 years ago, or maybe it was 25 years ago, showing a sled attached to his BlackBerry that could achieve a CAC card, and the whole thing was about the size of a brick by the time you were done.
Yes.
We want to go there too, because we want people to use these credentials. And so then, presuming that the CAC represents something that is trusted and trustable, what is the most contemporary architecture, I guess, for implementing effective identity security? We want to keep pace with people trying to hack us, the adversaries, and so forth. And maybe I'm going to go to Brian first here. And I think one of the themes here is separation of authentication from the application that you're trying to address, trying to
Right.
access, and somehow distilling that identity management piece and authentication piece separately from the application. So maybe describe that for us.
Yeah, and Tom, I think one of the key words that you said there was keeping pace. Look, there are a lot of different ways that we can do authentication and authorization in a workflow from a user perspective. And one of the traditional ways that we've done it is actually in, I don't want to just say the application layer, because there's a lot of different pieces within the application layer, but at the application itself. I go to log into the application, I get prompted for multi-factor, I do my authentication. Maybe there's some authorizations that happen. It's not always the case, but maybe there is. And I'm able to log into that application. That works if I only have one or two or three applications. But, going back to that keeping pace theme, what happens when I have a few hundred applications? What happens when I have a few thousand applications? And what happens when I need to respond to a new emerging threat? Or I need to integrate this additional component, right? I need a device level signal within my authentication. Is every application going to be able to support that? And the answer is, it just starts becoming so insurmountable of a challenge that we cannot keep the status quo of doing things in that way. Now, we've laid the groundwork in the federal government for many years about pulling back authentication, especially from the application endpoint, and doing it more still in the application layer, but within a federation context. That affords us a lot of ease of management. That ease of management allows us to be a lot quicker to new emerging threats. And now we're getting into this concept of really orchestrating at that federation layer. What does this mean? Well, now, rather than just checking proof of possession of private key of your PIV or your CAC, or an alternative, form factor, some of the challenges that actually Jerry very accurately kind of pointed out, now we can start bringing in other additional components. Okay, do I have an EPP? Do I have, a risk kind of AI engine, right? Let me marry these things together so they're not just standalone tools, but instead more a cohesive solution, so that I can gain the confidence that this particular individual at this particular time should be accessing this particular resource. And yeah, so in my opinion, I think only by moving to that type of model, and of course we do similar things for authorization as well, right? Don't have the authorization at the application endpoint, do it within zero trust language is like a policy enforcement point, but basically do it more in that centralized model. that allows me to just be a lot more adaptive to, especially to those emerging threats. Because otherwise, we're going to be chasing patches and updates and changes and never be able to scale the way that we need to.
Yeah, and so Jerry, there was a word there that Andrew used, that Brian used, and that is engine. It sounds like almost we need an identity and authentication engine that has some artificial intelligence in it, to throw in another buzzword, but that understands what it is that people have access to based on who they are and what their role is, what their job is. And this engine then becomes something that allows us to scale to the many applications people actually use or the databases they access.
Yeah, and what Brian I think is talking about as well is sustainability. I cannot, and it's going to reduce my security posture if I'm too complex and I can't sustain all these different methods that I potentially have when a change happens, and patch this, and all right, now I got to fix this thing a certain way. It's not sustainable, and I'm just going to have holes in my security, and that's not a good thing. So definitely what Brian's talking about is spot on. Totally agree. One of the things I also, and the engine is not just the authentication piece we're talking about. We're talking about all the other factors too. And we're not just talking about, we kind of started talking off about humans too, but machine to machine, they have an identity. Services, making sure we use those from an identity perspective as well. IoT, they have an identity, treating those as some kind of identity. And this engine would take in these factors of how did you authenticate, what kind of reliance do I have on that, or confidence do I have on that. There may be other factors of where you're coming from. Is it a dirty IP? Is it a geographical place IP where I don't want anybody logging in? Or is it someplace that is okay? And these factors add up to that confidence score. One of the other things that, one of the concepts that I have been advocating for and have yet to really see in true practice is ongoing authentication and ongoing access. Not just the one-time linear that we're used to in the past of coming in the door, all right, have a nice day. But really looking at all these factors constantly all the time. And I'm not talking about putting in your PIN every 5 minutes just to recheck, but really checking all these factors. Because why do I advocate for that? Because something can change. Yes, everything seems fine when I let you in the door and you start accessing your data or your application. However, something could change all of a sudden. All of a sudden, you don't seem to be acting like Tom or Brian. All of a sudden, hey, you just did impossible travel. Or all of a sudden something changes that's going to change a factor, and that engine will help drive a policy, whatever policies you take in place to reach that threshold and take the appropriate action, whether it be downgrade you or kick you off completely. But it's got to be ongoing. It can't be a linear one-time event, I think, when we talk about authentication and access.
Yeah, that's interesting. And something you mentioned related to something that Brian said too there, and that has to do with Internet of Things, or IoT. And those are not people, they're devices that need to be trusted. And you mentioned the device level signal. So that passed over pretty quickly, but the device level signal is an important factor here, isn't it, in the whole identity and authentication scheme, correct, Brian?
Not 100%. So an earlier argument that was happening, let's now, I think it's more generally accepted, but an earlier argument that I would have with individuals is your identity is not your driver's license, right? It's not who you are behind a keyboard. Yes, that's part of it. Excuse me. That's a part of it. But your actual identity is your digital identity, and that comprises a bunch of different things, including the device that you come from. So let's say I'm super trustworthy. Let's say that I have, a CAC or a PIV or even, a FIDO2 credential, right? Looking at more modern phishing resistant form factors. All of that checks out. But if I'm coming from a device that I shouldn't come from, then I shouldn't be allowed in, because there's risk associated with that. And that's what we mean by digital identity. We have to look at all of those things together. And a lot of that goes into what Jerry was talking about, with those different elements and those different risk kind of profiles. And the fact that things can change even after you've done that initial authentication, right? The way that users interact with systems and things like that can change on a moment by moment basis. The example I always give is, and it's not, I wish it was a hilarious example, but it's not, right? So I'm coming in from a version of Chrome, everything's patched, and then I decide I'm going to open up Internet Explorer and go into a different application. Well, no, I shouldn't trust that browser. And that's how digital identity changes on a moment basis, even though everything else is the same.
Yeah. Okay. So, right. And that's what Jerry was saying. Something changes within an impossible travel or something. And then clearly that device is no longer trustworthy. And we've got that going. Jerry, anything to add there? Because then I want to go to a couple of questions we have in the question. Now they're coming in fast in the question box.
No, nothing to add.
All right.
Brian
Well,
said it great.
let's go to the first question here. Can someone talk about the state of practice of creation of digital policies for authorization? Seems fine-grained access control is centered to ZTA per NIST. I guess that's zero trust something. Especially interested in policies not related to Chief Information Security Officer type policies like user location, user device health, and so on. So I think that's maybe what they're talking about. How about policies based on user attributes and roles combined with data tags, like a query to access a medical record? That all makes sense?
No, absolutely. And Jerry, I look to you too, right? This is, I think, something that's critical for the healthcare field in general, including HHS. But and we've seen this. I mean, we've seen it within the federal government, especially in certain types of networks and environments, where we look at, hey, whether or not that individual has been read on to a certain type of project, right? And we see this in the more sensitive areas of networks, and they've been doing attribute-based access control for a long time. So clarify, ABAC or attribute-based access control versus role-based access control. Role-based access control is actually a part of ABAC. It's not a separate thing. It's just more restrictive, right? Brian Rosenstiel, he's within Ping Identity, he's on the federal team. Let's say I'm an admin, or let's say I'm an auditor or something like that, right? Role-based, and we make restrictions off of it. Attribute-based access control takes that further, right? And part of it is user location and things like that, but there's also other attributes as well. Brian's coming in from a BYOD device. Brian's coming in from a GFE or government furnished equipment device. Additional other types of attributes. I'm a part of this particular type of program, things like that. That's where we're seeing OMB in their memorandum 22.9 saying, hey, look, use device level signals and start expanding out from role-based into attribute-based. And we've seen that really coming into play when we talk about patient rights from a PHI standpoint, right? So from a healthcare record standpoint, and making sure, hey, and we're all used to it where we have to sign a piece of paper and basically saying, hey, our significant other, our partner, our family member, our friend can gain access to our records. That is an attribute. We're seeing that digitized and modernized. We're especially seeing that with things like GDPR as well over in EMEA, in the European kind of zones. And we're starting to see that coming into play when we look at some of the things CCPA and others here in the US. So yeah, there's a reason why, from a zero trust architecture ZTA standpoint, that NIST is saying focus on this. And I actually point everyone to NIST Special Publication 800-160, I think it's 2, which actually is an ABAC NIST document that they kind of talk to some of these things as well and some of the differences.
Jerry?
Yeah.
State of creation of digital policies per authorization.
Yes. Yeah. I'm going to keep it a little simple. So, historically we've kind of done the, authentication and allow into the application and things, but we got to make decisions based on what that target is. If that target, like I said, the cafeteria schedule, okay, I don't mind everybody having access to that. But if it is like the medical records, based on how you're authenticating, based off the device, like we talked about, all those things, what is that target that you're trying to access, and make the decision based off the other factors, from the authentication to the device to all those things. Am I going to allow you for that or not? So I may be, I'm just going to use the example. You're using a PIV card on a fully managed laptop coming from a known network, which I have telemetry on and I can see. And all the factors just fully patched. Okay, I'm probably I'll let you have access that you're supposed to have, edit that document, access those medical records. However, if you are coming using a username password from a personal owned device, but the copy shop network, I'm probably not going to let you have that. Now, if you use something in between, like I used an authenticator on a mobile device, I might give you read access, but not full access that you have when I have all the other telemetry and things like that, because if it's a BYOD, I have limited telemetry and things. So but that's all based off what are you trying to get to. So understand that target, understand what the risk of that target is, understand the categorization of that, and then what those factors are, and build those policies based off what your risk tolerances are based on what that target data source is.
Okay, good. And on that note, I'm going to go to one of the polls, and I guess the staff will launch that poll online that everyone can vote. Am I correct? But there it is. Do you think your identity security model is effective? You pick one, yes, no, not sure. If you dare say yes, we'll find out where you are and test it. If no, we'll hack you anyway. And if you're not sure, you're okay. So take about 10 seconds to see that. Oh, come on. So I see 69 participants. That means 23 each said yes, no, and not sure.
That's about the most hilarious way that could have come out.
Pretty much, yeah.
So that's a tricky question, right? So I'd always answer that no. And the reason for that is the moment that you think that you're good enough is the moment that you're going to fall behind. Even if it is good enough for the threats today, like you should always want to be, how can I improve? How can I make things better? But yeah, that was a fun one.
Yeah, I would say going around saying that we are cyber secure and we have great identity management is kind of inviting bad karma, and maybe
I've heard people say that, and it just brings a chill up my spine, and I just shake my head like, oh yeah, all right, good for you.
Go to another question here. This is from BK. He says, I think many are using this in silos where network does its part, application does its part, identity does its part. Is there a separate engine that collects various signals and authorizations and make the decision? That's moving here on me, and make that decision as the user travels through the network to get to the endpoint. So that has to do with the changing conditions situation that Jerry mentioned, I think.
So one of the things I would say about this is, historically we depended on the network as the enforcer or the security enforcement, and we're kind of moving away with that with zero trust. The network's becoming more like the transport, so to speak. Get the bits and the bytes from A to B. Not be the enforcement point, because we're getting away from the castle moat, right? Where, we have the Tootsie Roll Pop. We have the hard outer shell, the soft GUI center. We trust everybody in that. No, we can't trust everybody. We trust no one. And, it's not always the malicious person, but it's just somebody trying to get their job done and they circumvent the security somehow. So we definitely want to cover that, because the bad guys can take advantage of that. But we are moving away from the network being that security enforcer and being more of the transport. And I think the other thing with this is that definitely this is an architecture now. It's not the silos that BK speaks of. We got to get away from the siloed things. Everything has to be integrated. We've been talking about, taking in all these factors, understanding all this information, bring it into this engine to kind of create that confidence score in a dynamic fashion. It's got to move because things change and the environment changes, and having those factors come in. So this is all, we got to bring all this telemetry in. So it's going to be very important to do a lot of integration throughout this journey.
And here's a really interesting question from DA. Do you see the federal identity system going to self-sovereignty, digital wallets, blockchain? I think that a wallet I own, I control, who I share my identity with are important in the future, and the ability to use facial identity, I guess that he means facial identity and a live face for super administrators, no pictures. Intrusion is going with, well, anyway. But what about that idea of you own your identity, you own your digital self? Can that be executed in a way, I guess, that can be trusted by the government? I think is what the question, what the spirit of the question is. And
I'm going to
DA,
take
just
it.
to weigh in again in the same box if I got it wrong.
I'm going to take maybe a controversial stance on this. It's, like, I totally understand this. So let me caveat the ability to have some identity that we can trust, that belongs to you, that you can take. That level of interoperability would be amazing, right? And it would solve a lot of problems that we have, even within the federal government. Something as powerful as the PIV and CAC doesn't have the interoperability that we would like it to. Being able to take it agency to agency and be able to use to authenticate. Now, this concept of self-sovereign identity is where I might take a little bit of a controversial stand, in that I don't actually own my identity. And what I mean by that is, so I'm Brian Rosenstiel, and I'm Brian Rosenstiel because the US government has acknowledged and assigned me a birth certificate. I've used that birth certificate to get driver's license, to get passports and things like that. I don't actually own that identity. That identity is something that the federal government has assigned. Because I trust the federal government, I trust me. And I think that's an important, and it's a bit controversial, right? Because a lot of people are like, well, no, it's intrinsic to you. But it goes back to that authoritative source. I have to have a way that I can trust something, that I can root something. And sadly, individuals aren't necessarily intrinsically trustworthy by themselves.
Hi. Yeah. Well, she owns her identity, or he. Can't tell. The person is coming in and out of focus, so we can't tell what your beautiful child there is. But they're glad.
Yeah, give me 1 second. I've got a sick one home with COVID, so
Oh,
you gonna say hi?
oh
Hi. Okay, give me 1
hi.
second.
You feel okay?
He's feeling better.
Okay, feeling better. I hope you feel better. All right. Well, that's why identity management matters so much. Yeah, Jerry, what's your thought on that whole idea of who is the sovereign of their identity?
Yeah, and Brian brings up some great points. And when I was thinking of this question, it's like, still, we were all required to get the real ID by what, May 2023, and a lot of states are slower than others, but that's supposed to be our federal identity. Yet I still have to have a passport as well. I have another form of identity there as well. But I see where this question, I kind of see, like, I just read an article the other day. When I go to the airport and I go to TSA, if I have a real ID, I just have to show them that. I don't have to show them my boarding pass anymore, because they're trusting that information of my boarding pass to be tied. And when they scan my real ID, they'll have all the information, where what plane I'm boarding on and everything. So I can kind of see where this concept is kind of going in this way, in a way. But to Brian's points, is I totally agree with him. I think it's kind of gonna be, it would be a tough road to hoe, going down this path. But you can kind of see some of the concepts and ideas, I think, trying to think that way and move that way. But I don't know if it will be totally come to fruition. Probably not in my lifetime.
Yeah, it almost takes us, the whole question almost takes us from the field of technology to the field of, I don't know, psychology, or the field
Yeah.
of philosophy.
Yeah, not a tech question.
The power to name something, was granted in the book of Genesis to mankind, if you really want to go back to all this. But we won't go there right now. I think a better place to go is to the next poll, which is, and this will pop up next, what do you think are the best practices for privileged access management controls? And I don't see sovereign ownership by the individual on there, but deploy zero trust, keep track of assets and privileges, employ temporary privilege escalation. So take 10 seconds to vote on that one. And we've talked about all of these so far this morning. And now there's 65. I think a couple of people left to go, pick up a sovereign identity maybe. All right, deploy zero trust everywhere. There's people, that's the plurality of votes. I guess people are in line with 22.9 directive then. Keep track of assets and privileges, employ temporary privilege escalation, yes, and deploy attribute-based access control, 23%. I mean, in some sense, these are all part of the mix, would you say, Jerry?
Yeah, I mean, they all fall, you should be practicing all these within your zero trust architecture as you're developing it. If I looked at it, take the zero trust piece out of it, of course, that's the standard answer because all those things fit there. But I'm a big fan of just in time, just enough access, right? Somebody to elevate themselves and not perpetually be administrators, because one of the things is how would we used to give privilege access? We usually added them to a group, and as a result of being part of that group, they inherit these elevated privileges and these privilege access. However, when they're not being in use, nobody's taking them out of that group because it was a manual process. So the concept of, all right, requesting the access, being given those privileges, and after a certain amount of time being pulled from that, so that if that account gets compromised, it doesn't have access to anything. It doesn't have that privilege access or those elevated accesses. So I'm a big fan of just enough and just in time administration, where you automate it so that that access is pulled automatically. If I'm still using it, I probably not got to pull it. But if it's dormant then, and after a certain amount of time, you get pulled from that. So you no longer have those elevated privileges. So that's a big thing that we're trying to do.
And we've got some questions again in the box, but I want to ask two quick questions of you both. And that is the importance of two elements, and if there's a way around those ultimately, again, for purposes of authentication and identifying people to use government applications, or if it's corporate, the corporate applications, and not in the philosophical sense. But one is name, the actual name that you type, Brian Rosenstiel, Jerry Karen, because I always wonder about people named Jim Smith, of which there are probably a million people with the same name, or John Smith, or I actually knew a Mary Rowe once. And so is there a way around that as actually an important factor, given the machine's level signals and digital elements otherwise associated with an identity? And then my second one will be password, name and password. I guess the young Rosenstiel might have shown up again.
Yeah.
So Larry, we'll go to you.
So just first name, last name's not enough. It's got to be another attribute of some sort. I know with, banks or loan applications, they ask for an SSN because that's unique to me. So it's got to be something that's unique. I know my last job, they were working on a unique employee ID. And one of the things is, once you get that employee ID, like I've seen people come be a government employee and they come back as a contractor the next day. They're the same person. Now they're necessarily going to get the same access to things, but they're the same person. So having, that employee ID from its inception through the end of time, should remain with that person as much as best as possible, because it's unique to them and that they're that same person. So definitely it's got to be another attribute so you can determine which Jim Smith is not, right? Like I'm Gerald Karen the third. There was at one time on this earth, there was 4 of us, Gerald Karens. Now, if somebody said Gerald Karen, it could be, we would all be in the same room and say, yes, but that suffix made a determination of who we were. But you have to use another attribute. Just can't be first name, last name. That's not going to work.
I guess my question really was, and again, with the password, we've been talking about removing the password as a factor for so long now. Could name also join password as something that's not that relevant anymore? And then you get out of that problem. Multiple.
Password's got to go.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
No worries. And I agree with everything that you said, Jerry, for sure. I think where I would take it further, so from a technical aspect, we've got a directory behind a lot of these technologies, and that directory doesn't allow for collisions. We see this when, I want to get an email address. If my email address is already taken, I have to get a different email. That's actually why you see so many organizations using the username as your email, because basically they're taking a cheat card in that I know that, Brian Rosenstiel at pingidentity.com, there's not going to be a collision because that's on ping to make sure there's no collision. And I can piggyback off of that. Ultimately, whether or not we use your first, last name, whether or not we use email address, whatever we use, it's going to go down to a directory. And then we can also combine other attributes as well. This kind of gets us into, especially when we talk about citizen and just IAM in general, consumer identity access management, we get into this scenario where I can take a user and build a risk profile, and Jerry, you were talking about this earlier, and then the aggregate of all that determines how much I actually need to prompt that user from an authentication standpoint based upon the riskiness of the application or resource that they're going to. That's a way, maybe we don't get rid of passwords in day one, but we reduce the amount of times we ask for the password as that first step to getting away from it. In the federal government, it's a little bit different, right? PIV, CAC is a great just quick replacement for most applications of getting away from username and password. Username is actually on the CAC, right? There's a specific entry within that card, and that is what's used for username. It actually goes to a directory entry, just in case anyone's curious how that works. But yeah, that's what we're moving towards, and we're seeing that, especially in the that consumer space, right? When you're logging in to
You bet.
banks and
Okay,
things like
good.
that.
There's a couple of questions here. One seems to mainly deal with architecture and one to technology or product. So let's go with the architecture one from Richard S. Is there any way to really getting to the next level without disassociating identity determination, without a back-end connection to a network identity determiner? For example, a zero trust architecture policy decision point. Disassociating identity determination without a back-end connection to a network identity determiner. And I see contemplation going on. And so while you think about that one, the next question, is there a single engine that collects these inputs, process, and effectively makes a decision to get an endpoint the user is trying to access? I guess maybe to an application, the end user is trying to access, not so much the endpoint is trying to access it. So I thought all the pillars are going to coordinated fashion.
So these are.
That sounds like the skeleton key question.
They're absolutely different questions,
Right.
and I'm chewing a little bit on that next level part with the disassociated identity determination. But they have a framework in, I think, a similar place. So one of the and I've had this conversation with NIST, and we've had this. So when you look at 800-207 and you look at zero trust and you see policy decision point, you see policy enforcement point, you see the control plane, it leads to a thought process of I can only have one policy engine. And it needs to work across all the different pillars, and people are looking for that. When you read it, and I'm not saying that that's what both of these individuals have necessarily said. In fact, I would love one tool to rule them all. Of course, you get into a little bit of the problem of jack of all trades, master of none. Especially in the federal government, we demand mastery because of the level of attack vectors that are seen on a daily basis. But 80207 actually allows for multiple policy decision points, multiple policy enforcement points. It's really a layer. And so with an identity, I'm going to have these elements. But even within the identity, right? So if I break down workflow and make this more of an example. So I'm going to have a policy decision point within a federation engine that's going to go in and connect different points. Within that, I will actually have separated duties. I will have an MDM, and that MDM is in control of those mobile devices on the endpoints. It's going to make a decision, right? I don't want my federation engine doing that because my federation engine isn't an MDM. I'm going to establish this trust and allow that decision to happen separate from my federation decision point. But based upon the information I receive, that's where that policy gets enforced, right? So you can see how these things get interconnected. Now, that system runs on identity. My network layer is going to have similar types of things. Now, I might be able to connect them, but I don't necessarily have to, in my opinion, right? If I've got strong zero trust elements within my network layer and it identifies a problem, I am fine with it shutting down the connection, even if my identity system has passed all the checks and is still doing fine. I'm okay if these operate a little bit independently. And that allows me to have those different types of controls in place. And I think this is where I'm stretching a bit, right? I think that's kind of the intent of these different elements. But I have sensed that there has been this incessant need of, oh no, I can only have one, and I need one tool that rules them all. And I think that leads us down a pathway where again, we're just going to get something that just doesn't do everything perfect, and doesn't do everything well, and that's going to provide us a problem down the road on execution standpoint.
Yes, because Jerry, those operating such as yourself in the government, you hear the complaint all the time that there's a lot of tools and more tools than we can get value out of. So if you have one that tries to do everything, you're getting all the value you can from that single tool, that single license, as the case might be, but then it's not really optimized for anything. If you optimize every little thing, then you pay a lot of money and you have a lot of complexity in your operations, and you don't really realize the full value of any given tool. Is that a good way to state the?
Yeah, you know how many times I've been sold a single pane of glass? Oh, that term just drives me nuts because I refute it every time. But yeah, Brian said it very well. That picture in 800-207 is nice, and it's a nice nirvana, and I think it simplifies kind of to depict what zero trust kind of looks like. But he's absolutely right. The identity aspect is going to have some kind of risk or confidence score to it of how you authenticated. The network, whatever tools is going to have some kind of risk or confidence score. So they're kind of like control gates, right? You have this gate, okay, you were good enough to pass that one, this one. Now, now we're making it sound like, all right, now I got to go through this. I got to go through this. How long is it going to take me to get to this thing? No, it will be as quick as possible. But one of the things I'm also looking at is bringing that telemetry in. I think we can get into talking about machine learning and AI and what normal looks like, so that we can start understanding that and make decisions based off that, because we're not going to be able to wait for a human to make these decisions. But having that one very nice central policy engine is I don't think the reality right now, and it's more like how Brian describes it, definitely. That I see from the demos that I've seen, where I've seen kind of an integrated zero trust type of environment. That's kind of the way it's worked, and it's still what you see in 800-207 and that singular policy engine depiction. It's still accomplishing all of those things. It's the concept and the requirements that policy engine is doing, and how it's being done in reality, it's still meeting those requirements of what that picture is trying to depict.
Yeah, I think in many ways it seems like the whole identity and authentication verification process is trying to keep up with how dynamic the network world has become. The number of devices, the number of networks, and the number of assets that people are trying to reach. If you worked in a large corporation 30, 40 years ago, you had a terminal which was hardwired to a single network, to a single vendor, to a single mainframe, and all you had to do was your name and password. And if you forgot to log out, you'd get a nasty note on your desk at night, and the second time you were fired. But the architectures are so much more variated that we kind of need, from that hardwired SN, system 20, what was it, 25 system S, whatever it was called, that the old system 25 standard. Now you need something that is dynamic. And I think dynamic is really the word that applies to everything we've been talking about. Comments?
It absolutely has to be dynamic. You're absolutely right. It can't be this one time. Factors change. Everything can change on a dime. Brian is acting like Brian, Brian's acting like Brian, but all of a sudden Brian isn't acting like Brian. I got to do something. So you gotta have the telemetry. You gotta have the good monitoring in place to be sure that you're taking the appropriate actions for the different risk thresholds that you put in place policy wise.
Yes, Brian stops being the spokesperson for Ping and is suddenly Brian the dad dealing with a kid at
Yes.
home. So there's a good example of changing identities within the site.
Yeah,
of
he has dual identities there.
Right.
Yeah.
Another question from the audience. An individual can be in multiple directories. I am in my company directory, and because I have a PIV, I'm an agency directory in one. My identity is the same, that is, his personship is the same, but I can't use credentials from one to access the other. Do you envision a future in which an individual has one digital identity that works across multiple environments, say corporate and government? That kind of gets to the sovereign identity issue. Not precisely, but it's related to that question, it seems.
Yeah, Brian probably has a much better explanation, but one thing that can be done is depending on what that agency is and my relationship to it, I can trust them in some kind of business to business trust, where I can trust that they've done authentication because I understand how they authenticate with their, and I can trust that and get those SAML tokens or whatever and allow them in from that perspective. So there's possibilities around this, but it's just establishing that relationship and that trust, if you truly trust it. And I'm sure Brian has dealt with this in Ping.
Well, what I would love to have, and I'm just going to say it, is a national ID, and one that could be used.
Right. I was wondering when that was going to come up.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily decentralized in that way, right? Because we have to have roots of trust in order to be able to trust it. But if I had one identity that then I could use, and many different organizations could actually verify. And I'm on my philosophical box here, right? My soapbox. But that allows me to not necessarily have to enroll with each organization for them to have a little root of trust. I need to have that centralized root of trust. I think that's at the heart of what a lot of this is. I need to have some identity that I can carry with me and bring with me, right? This is where we see the digital wallets, where we hear some of those other aspects. And I couldn't agree more. Whether or not we actually get that implemented, I'm less confident on, right? Just because there's a whole host of reasons. I don't think we'll see a national ID in the United States for a lot of reasons. But it sure would be nice if we did.
Right. Well, yes, that comes up from time to time, and it never just gains any legislative traction because I don't think there's a lot of cultural traction for it. And we could talk about that all day, but for another time. We do have one final poll, and then we have one more question, and I think that'll bring us to the top here. Do you think ID management is essential to protecting the data protecting data in the federal government? Well, does anyone disagree with that? Let's see, find out. All right. Many years ago, I covered a small town in New Hampshire for a small newspaper, and they had an annual town meeting. And most of the town was in agreement on everything, and people would literally vote. The town residents would come to vote on things. And there was a moderator for the town. And there was one person that always voted no, even though she was in favor of it, an older lady. And there was some obscure legal principle that required at least one person to not be in, so it wasn't unanimous. And I forget the legal reasoning, but she explained to people, I'm only voting no because of this legal requirement. So maybe that person just said no because legally we have to have someone disagree here. Not sure. And here's the final question from Eric V. Thoughts on using decentralized verifiable credentials for just-in-time permissioning to applications, just-in-time permissioning. Do you think decentralization plays a role in the evolution of digital identity for public sector? So I guess decentralization means a federated system, or you're not sure what precisely that is meant by, but Brian maybe can
Just-in-time permissioning is super interesting. Just-in-time permissioning is not provisioning, right? It's a separate concept of I only get access to this application when I need it, and then is stripped away, right? We see this a lot within privileged access management, and it's something that we actually need just overall. 1 second.
There's privileged access management for you.
And so that's actually an important thing. That's not intrinsic to the identity. That's intrinsic to the attributes of the individual. Yeah, he agrees with me. It's not intrinsic to the identity. So that's where we have to have attributes play. So the decentralized, again, this concept of I need to have an identity that I can bring. It allows me to have this root of trust. I don't have to go through the provisioning process to give that user a new credential that I trust. I can accept it and bring it in. But that doesn't get us to just-in-time permissioning. In my opinion, we have to have a set of attributes that say, okay, this user, we can trust this user. We know who they are. We do the authentication. The authorization is actually going to be on things that we control. And that's what's going to determine whether or not they get access at this time. Not to go on too much of a tangent, we see this a lot from the initial kind of use cases for FirstNet. Local permissions escalated for DHS, like drone video feed and stuff like that, and national disasters.
Okay, good. Yeah, a specified network. And Jerry, final word?
I can't top Brian on that one.
Oh, I tell you what, you can
That's for
answer
sure.
this last question that came in. What lessons have you learned, or I guess have we as the community learned from SolarWinds, RE Authentication, ADFS, and SAML? And I've used all those acronyms, but they're not at the tip of my tongue.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to. So, oh man, we're running out of time. This could be a long answer. Learned a lot of lessons. We got to depend on vendors to be successful, of course. And some of the things from SolarWinds is, one of the things that we saw was, the lateral movement, right? Once you're in, they gain persistence and they move laterally. So how can we eliminate that so that, I'm an assume breach kind of guy, so if Tom, the malicious actor, got in, I don't want him to move laterally. So how can I contain him as best I can? So definitely something that, is to be focused on as we go through zero trust. The federating identities is something that's good from a user standpoint. Single sign-on, being able to move better seamlessly, not have to remember username and passwords for 20 different applications and things like that, which they hate. But I'm starting to herd those cats of those identities. So anytime federation, whether it be a ping, an Okta, ADFS, whatever, is a good thing. So definitely those are some things that I would advocate.
All right. And we didn't even get into Fido and SASE, but that'll be for another panel.
We could go forever.
We
Yes.
could go on forever. Hey, listen, this has been a really great panel. Some deep technology, some deep philosophical thinking, some deep ways to think about approaching this from an architectural and strategic standpoint. I hope everyone, took notes on this one because it was that kind of detailed. So I want to thank Brian Rosenstiel and Jerry Karen. Great discussion. And thank you all that sent in questions, really deep, detailed questions. Fantastic. Good to be with you. I'm going to sign off now, and I guess I turn it back to Hannah. Alyssa.
Yes, thank you guys. That was great. Up next, we're going to have one more panel for today. So I will turn it over to Dave, who will be moderating it. So Dave, over to you. Oh, Dave, you're muted.
There we go. Before we begin, I just want to encourage everyone to submit their questions for the Q&A section of this platform. We're going to go through them throughout the panel. Please send them in as we go. And also remember that we have 3 poll questions as we get through this, and to ensure you get your CPE credits, definitely answer those. I'll now introduce our panelists. If you'd like to give a wave when I call your name, please do. With us today, we have Grant Dasher, the identity and access management expert at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and Matt Topper, president and solutions catalyst at Uber Ether. So I want to start with, maybe you guys can tell us what's new with your agency and with your company and across the government when it comes to identity. Grant, I know that you were the author behind one of the authors behind M2209. So maybe you can give us a little bit of a background and update on what's been going on with you first.
Sure, yeah, and I don't want to take too much credit for it. I think, it was a team effort. It was led out of OMB, but we did provide some support on that memo from CISA. So I wouldn't go so far as to call myself the author. That's a stretch, but certainly we helped provide feedback on that document as it was being drafted. Look, I think CISA's mission is to one of our missions, we're America's Cyber Defense Agency, and so one of our missions is to help protect federal agencies from cyber compromise, in addition to other critical infrastructure stakeholders and state and local governments, things like that, to provide assistance, render assistance to them. And so in the federal context, we work closely with other organizations like OMB, like ONCD, like agency CIOs and CISOs to help support cyber defense. And I think that increasingly identity, is becoming a part of that more so than it had previously been. I think there's, in my opinion, sort of always been a bit of a strange division in the cybersecurity community between, security people, which typically meant network security people, and or endpoint security people, and identity. But I think that has, been breaking down industry-wide over the last couple of years, especially with, remote work and zero trust and all these kinds of things that are going on. And so we're seeing that same sort of transition at CISA, where we're seeing a larger role in the identity space in the government because of its importance in terms of, defending federal networks and federal systems against adversaries. So that's really what we've been up to, building up our strength in the identity area, understanding how to support efforts that are going on in the government in this area in authentication. Been a big push recently around MFA and phishing resistant MFA in particular, trying to support that. So yeah, lots going on. And we're trying to produce increasing guidance. We have our zero trust maturity model, our cloud security reference architecture, our recent SCUBA technical reference architecture. There's going to be more coming soon in those spaces in terms of additional guidance to agencies and other stakeholders to help them hopefully shore up their identity infrastructure because we know it's so important. So yeah, that's sort of what we've been up to.
And Matt, can you tell us a little bit about Uber Ether and what you've been doing with respect to zero trust identity and how you've been helping agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. So Uber Ether's been in the federal government building identity solutions for over a decade now. And really, our thing from the beginning is how can we make this simpler for agencies? So the big three things we've been working on lately is we just completed our security assessment report for a FedRAMP High DoD Impact Level 5 managed service that brings together the best of breed, in our opinion, IAM vendors to actually have a platform that works for agencies, right? Identity is hard enough with getting the data quality right within organizations. So, and then we see all these organizations buy a whole bunch of vendors and spend millions of dollars bringing them together. And it's 18 months before they're showing value. So our goal is to make that days, not years, and then give it a platform that is built on the federal government best practices that follow the FAR clauses for user governance. And then with that, a hardened multi-factor authentication service. Anyone who believes you're going to go into an agency and replace their existing identity provider, and even assuming that an organization has one identity provider is a stretch for most government agencies right now. So building pluggable FIDO as well as contextual-based access control that sits and works with existing agency identity providers. And then on top of that, as we see more organizations moving towards federation, I think, and we'll get into this in a little bit, right? The break from PKI that a PIV or CAC is your only credential in the federal government. We're going to see more federation happening. And there's a new NIST document coming out later this year talking about that and building better trust between agencies. So come to a federation operator, get your metadata, know that that's the authoritative source. And then when you trust your peer federal agencies, know that that is the one place to trust for the federation agreement and not what we saw in SolarWinds, where new IDPs stood up by adversaries coming from different places and organizations didn't know to trust or not. And most of the time, that's how they pivoted and got in. So that's all we're doing.
Quite a handful. On that note, I want to pull up our first poll question. I use the following types of two-factor authentication when logging into my accounts. Check all that apply. Something you have, a smart card, RSA key, phone, or RFID badge. Something you know, a password, PIN number, or a security question. Something you are, biometric authentication, like a fingerprint scan or facial recognition, or other. It's a lot, so I'll give people a moment to lock in all their responses. All right. So 81% for both something you have and something you know, and then we have 33% something you are, biometric stuff. So I want to get your guys' take on this. What do you make of this breakdown? Does this reflect what you've been seeing in government, and is it concerning? Is it reassuring?
Matt, why don't you go first?
Sure. I'll be honest, I see in federal government mostly just that PIV-CAC smart card authentication as the only thing, and really not seeing as much movement to the other factors as I would expect. And I think the next year as we get more guidance from NIST, but I loved the other box, because the one thing I always love to talk about is there's so much we can get out of users' context, because how many times do we change the browser, the operating systems we use? And those factors are really a good fingerprint. So hopefully that's where some of those other buckets fall into.
Yeah, I mean, look, people use their PIV cards to sign into their identity provider at most agencies, but they don't use them to sign into most systems, right? Like, or not most systems, many systems, right? So we have lots of data that suggests that, you know, we are pushing very hard for MFA. We are really leaning into MFA. Agencies are doing their best to deploy MFA. But in some cases, it's just really hard to do because of legacy, because of complexity, because of this, that, and the other reasons, because of poor support for the technologies that we use for MFA, because of cost of acquiring other MFA technologies, et cetera. And so I think, you know, I suspect most government employees use more than a couple of passwords to access a number of systems in their day-to-day experience, in addition to using their PIV-CAC for a bunch of stuff. And so I think that's really what we're trying to figure out how to change, is to get to universal phishing resistant MFA, as opposed to, you know, signing it into AD with your smart card and then use ADFS to connect to some systems, but not all systems, which is kind of the state today.
You touched on it a little bit there, but what do you see as some of the biggest challenges standing in the way of implementing centralized identity management? And what advice would you give to agencies on how to overcome those challenges?
Sure. So I think the problem has been traditionally there hasn't been a long legacy of centralized identity programs within agencies. And it's been right under the CIO, sometimes under the CISO, but nobody's really owned identity. And we're starting to see in most organizations, right, that is coming under the CISO. As Grant said earlier, it is getting more aligned with the typical security operations teams and the network operations teams, and being seen as part of that. But it's also as we're collapsing those things and moving towards zero trust, trusting the networks less and less. That is where we're seeing, right, that funding finally come together, the understanding of what it takes to build an identity system. As I said earlier, right, a lot of the identity faults are, right, all of the decentralized data for the users when they're joining, when they're leaving, right? I always joke, the contractor that's been with the agency longest has more access than the director, because we don't do a good job at recertifying their access. When they leave one contract and join another, they just gain it over time. So, right, we're finally getting to a point with some of the work CIS has done with the master user record and master device records, creds, priv, all that along with it, to bring that together, make sure that data is clean. And that's always been one of the biggest troublesome first steps. We do a lot of DoD work, and you'd be amazed how hard it is to answer the question of who is that contractor's manager and who owns the responsibility of why that person is allowed on our network today. And as simple as that sounds, like you should be able to get an answer, it's really complex when you dive into it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that. I think, identity, not, and 1917 says, thou shalt have an ICAM program management, governance body. Not every agency has one. A number do, an increasing number do, and that's great, and something we're, encouraging in our work with agencies. I think that an enterprise focus on identity at just as an organizational level didn't necessarily exist. I mean, identity is an interesting area because it integrates with the security office, it integrates with HR, it integrates with cybersecurity, it integrates with CIO and all the systems, which really means that an organization needs a program and a capable program office that can maintain the relationships with all those stakeholders, figure out in their organization where it best makes sense to do that. And so I think that's the first thing that people really have to get in place. And the organizations that have done that have been able to work through the technical challenges. I mean, there are a number of technical challenges with any enterprise service, certainly some that are specific to identity. Part of the issue, as I've seen it, is what's good enough, right? There is technology out there in the market that is okay at being used to solve identity and federation problems and is largely free to agencies because it's part of something that they've already procured, and that is widely used, right? And then there's a question of like, okay, well, should I go past that and really invest in an enterprise ICAM system that has more features, that lets me integrate with more things, that lets me solve more of my problems, but what is the cost of that? What are the benefits? Understanding those trade-offs is another area. I also think there's just an expertise issue. I think that the number of people in our community who have deep identity expertise is not significant, and they sort of move around between agencies, or in some cases retire, and getting a new generation of people who sort of build these skills, who understand the parts of this that are unique to the government, the parts of this that are true in the broader industry, how this works together. This sort of comes back to this question of identity as part of the cybersecurity community, and building a sort of population of people who can really think about identity as a cybersecurity problem, and a management problem, or in the other elements of it. And I think the combination of those things is really what I think is the most important. The technology is there. It's harder to use than it needs to be. It could be made simpler, especially with the move to the cloud and the embrace of some of the new sort of cloud identity technology that's out there. I strongly think there's an opportunity to really simplify this for government stakeholders and make it easier to adopt, best in breed technologies. And that's something that we're looking at CISA. How do we support doing that kind of thing? But yeah, I think it requires a focused enterprise effort, and in some cases, like these big departments, an incredibly complicated focused enterprise effort, because they have so many layers of organizations inside of them. They're some of the largest and most complicated organizations on the planet. Certainly that's true of DoD, but it's also true of the big civilian agencies. And I think that's another element that's critical.
Before we move on to poll question 2, I do want to acknowledge we had a comment and a question on poll question 1. Wendy mentioned that even your PIV requires something i.e. the PIN. And then Stephen Bryan had a question. Do you think it is possible to verify intent without using what you know or a knowledge-based input? The question's for either one of you.
So I'll take them. Yeah, that's true. I mean, right, the PIN is a multi-factor cryptographic authenticator. It has both elements to it. Look, I think the intent verification element is interesting. I don't necessarily think you have to do it as just at a theoretical level as a knowledge factor unlocking some sort of a component of your authenticator, or even a separate knowledge factor. I mean, I think you need some way to deal with like local access problems, right? Like, like someone gets physical access to the computer or the card or whatever. How do you, or the token, how do you deal with that? Is it a biometric? Is it a PIN? Is it a knowledge factor? Is it integrated with unlocking your laptop the way it is in Windows or in some other setups like in the private sector that's also done, but in different ways? So yeah, I mean, I think you need to consider both the remote attack, where it's really the cryptographic key material and the ability to prevent the remote attacker from accessing that, and the local attack, where really it's like, what's the knowledge factor? If you have a platform, if the card is sitting in the laptop, or if it's a platform authenticator. And by the way, I think the platform thing is fine. Like, I don't think you need a trigger card that you extract and remove. The vast majority of attacks are remote, right? They're remote actors somewhere else. But you do need something to deal with that possibility of someone, swiping the laptop. It's why we encrypt our hard drives. So, I mean, that's my thoughts on that.
110% agree. Like, it amazes me how little we have taken the PIV, CAC, and then immediately just built a derived credential on the device with the existing TPM. Right? It's so simple to say, bootstrap that. I've got that physical card. Now I'm going to bind it to the identity of that device. And then we can put that same PIN, those same level of security, because you have that access to the thing at the time. And I mean, in so many cases, that would also help with some of the zero trust problems of joining the person and device and binding those things together. So Grant, I'm going to maybe trap you a little bit, but you said something that like has tugged at my heartstrings a lot over the last couple of years. We see so much in federal government with the investment in cyber and building a cyber capability. And when we look at what that means in traditional training inside of the government, right? Everyone wants to be a red teamer or a blue teamer. Nobody ever talks about, I want to be an identity engineer, and how an identity engineer, like, that makes you the best blue teamer because you actually understand how these things work together. And when you look at things like NIST framework, if you're looking for the word identity, it's buried 3 layers deep in some kind of random niche network engineer or software engineer role and doesn't stand on its own. Is there anything changing with that, with the messaging of what the federal government in general is doing to raise that visibility of identity engineers as the first pillar of zero trust? Please.
I mean, so look, like, I'm pretty sympathetic to this point of view, right? As you might imagine, I think, we are, I mean, what can I say? I can say Chris Inglis and Shalenda Young just issued a memo that said that zero trust architecture is, the top cybersecurity priority for agencies, and identity is the first pillar of zero trust architecture. So that implies that identity is understood to be among the topmost cybersecurity issues facing agencies. I do think not just in the government, but in general in the community. I mean, there are security conferences and there are identity conferences, and I've been to both, and a number of people have been to both, but there are a lot of people who only go to one or the other. And I think that, the growth of the cloud, the use of these technologies that are reliant more on, identity and access, the attacks like SolarWinds, where people are like, oh, wait, what is this ADFS thing that, like, they pivoted and allowed me to get, admin or whatever. I think things like that, really have started to blur the lines between the communities, really start to create more focus. And I mean, I think things like, there's things the government has done, nice framework, guidance that we've issued, pubs that have been issued. I think, what you've seen is that, our director is out there tweeting cybersecurity advice. Her primary cybersecurity advice that she's tweeting is to enable MFA. So that does show you that there's, some crossover happening, increasingly so. I think in general, at some level, it's on us as identity people to make identity cool to other people. So people want to come be identity people, and sort of make that connection and help people understand that, this is a really powerful tool to understand, in terms of being a blue teamer. The red teamers understand identity, right? At least a lot of them do, because it's one of the ways they compromise the networks. But yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
All right. So I'll see you at Black Hat then, I guess. Help that crossover, right?
Grant, you mentioned SolarWinds, which tees up our next audience Q&A nicely. Miriam over at NextGov, can the speakers please elaborate on lessons learned from the SolarWinds hack and how coming guidance might look to address the lateral movement that we saw through Microsoft's Active Directory Federation service?
Oh, that's a loaded one. I'll take a first cut at it. So I think I'll just set my understanding of the framework on the SolarWinds side and what happened, right? Bust in through one way, but attackers are realizing that if you gain access to Active Directory and or the identity provider within an organization, that really lets you become the king of the organization. Because in most cases, that'll let you move laterally within the network or gain access at an administrative level to give you access to other things that let you move laterally within the network, whether that's through AD groups or the admin of this is also the admin of this. So we've seen them come in, take over AD, but then also get smart enough to say, okay, AD might be where the credentials being bound to, but then we have ADFS or Okta or Ping, whatever that identity provider is, or Azure AD directly, and they build a trust with their own federation, or they take the keys from the federation that exists within an organization, stand up their own, and then come in from the outside, right? Microsoft actually has a great paper on how they started detecting some of that after SolarWinds. So lessons learned, obviously, right? Protect, right, the credentials to all of your people, right? Look for, right? They were very smart. They would come in, gain admin access for a very short amount of time, generate an account that had just about every privilege they needed, but wasn't an admin, right? So that most organizations have a flag or a bell and a whistle that goes off when you try and become a super admin. Well, they were smart enough to get it really fast, remove it. So then by the time an analyst comes in, and it's all scripted, so it happens within milliseconds, comes in, oh, that's gone, whatever, someone flipped something in, got rid of it, no one digs deeper, right? So lessons learned, right? Anytime any escalated privilege, bring that back to your identity governance tool, right? Majority of your SIM tools today, when those alerts go off, have a way to trigger and tell your identity governance tool that, hey, a change just happened to things you care about. Did you do it? And if the identity governance tool says no, well, dig in deep and fast. The other piece with the keys, and this is right, why we've started to be so strong on the idea of a federation operator, is when you are federating between organizations, having a third-party centralized set of trust, right? That says, hey, for an organization, if I'm DHS, right, this is my metadata, this is what we publish, these are the endpoints that you should expect us to be coming from. And unless it makes it to the central repository and is basically walked through a governance allow process within there, don't take it from anywhere else. And right, that works both within an organization as well as across organizations. This has surprisingly been extremely common in higher education. Right, if you're a student, you can pretty much walk onto any college campus globally with thousands of colleges, millions of people across the world, and get free internet access because I have an @msu.edu address. Right, bringing that same level of trust and framework that enables citizens, but to the federal government space and all the organizations we work with, that's the way I think we're going to protect and do better with things like SolarWinds. Grant, I know you were very close to that when everything went down.
I mean, a couple things to say about that. Yeah, so I think, understanding the trust boundaries and surface area within your infrastructure. So for example, I think people were surprised in some cases that compromising a domain allowed you to compromise admin in the cloud because you federated your domain to your cloud, including federating your admin accounts. But I think, if someone had carefully looked at the way a particular architecture was designed, they might have realized, hey, I need this federation for most cases, but do I want it for my admin accounts? Probably not, right? I probably want my admin accounts in the cloud to have a separate root of trust that is, understood and narrower and isn't bringing in all the surface area of my legacy on-prem that I have to leave NTLM turned on in because I have to support that one app out there that is 10 years old. And I think an understanding of root in X, what does it actually take to get admin in the cloud identity infrastructure, in the cloud CSP tenant admin? What are the systems that are in scope of that? Some sort of modeling of one's architecture is, I think, a really important, lesson learned. I think another one is, just realizing that, adversaries understand how our operations work, and they will design their attacks to avoid the way that our operations work. So Matt gave one example of this. Another example of this would be, what IP address is the attack being launched from? Is a conditional access policy that says, block access from outside of the United States, what security value is that actually adding against sophisticated adversaries? Probably not very much, given the ease of spinning up a VM in the United States, or other ways to get around something like that. And so I think, the other takeaway is really not being lulled into a false sense of security based on certain, simplified models of the way the adversaries think. And that's unfortunate, right? Because that just makes our jobs harder. But I think that's another important lesson learned.
Now I'm going to move on to poll question number 2. What's your overall reaction to M2209 and its release? Excited to implement it, unsure about what it means, not ready to implement it. All right, let's take a look at those results. All right, so we got pretty much an even mix of excited to implement, but also unsure about what it means. So Grant, I'm going to go to you with that one. I guess what do you see as like the key takeaways that the audience here today should have from that document, from that guidance?
Yeah, so it's an interesting document, right? It's not really a sort of broad statement of of everything. It's really like, hey, there's a strategic goal here, which is we want to move to a zero trust architecture. CISA has a maturity model. DoD has done a lot of work to define what this means to them. But M2209 has very specific things in it. Centralized identity management, phishing resistant authenticators, exploration of alternative authenticator technology, encrypted DNS. Things in each of the pillars that are very specific, manual pen testing. And that was intentional, right? The idea was to sort of do some thought-provoking things that would be hard and disruptive to do, but would give people some exposure to new approaches to cybersecurity, rather than just sort of a continual refinement of their existing, layering in more products and capabilities and sort of breadth first working their way towards something. We recognized that there needed to be some disruptive activities. There needed to be some freedom for innovative elements of the government to do some experimentation, to really try and do things differently to achieve a better optimum than the current local optimum that a lot of people are working towards. And so there was a balancing act there towards like opening up the door to certain people to do some experimentation around how they do, for example, authentication or network security, but also, postulate some very specific actions that we wanted people to try and work towards to sort of think through what these ideas would mean in their infrastructure. So it's hard to write stuff like this. I think the folks up at OMB, Eric and Stephen McAndrews at the time, now Mitch, Krista Russia, they all did in my view, a great job of trying to, push the envelope of the possible and introduce some new ideas into the ecosystem. I think the lesson will be, whether we can actually pull it off over the next coming years, right? It's easy to write a memo to state some things that would be good, it's much harder to actually implement them given the fiscal constraints, the technical constraints, the staff constraints, the program constraints, operational constraints. It's much harder, right? And so I don't know that we know if it's going to be successful, but I think there's an understanding that we have to make the best try we can to change the way we've been approaching cybersecurity to account for the kinds of threats that we face in this environment.
Matt, curious if you had any reaction to the memo.
I mean, personally, it was a thank goodness it's about time, right? There had to be something that was more of a grenade than a evolutionary, you should do stuff and things, right? And I think more so the follow-up afterwards and how serious, right, all of OMB, GSA, all the agencies have taken it to start moving forward. And I think 23, 24, 25 are really going to be the years we see a lot of the movement to move these things forward, right? Just timing wise, when it came out, right, I think the government missed most of the 22 budget cycles, and most of that was pulling from existing funding to get the setup and planning ready to go. And these next 3 years are going to be the critical changes we see. And not only internally, but there's been a ton of, hey, we also need to do this for the citizen side. We also need to do this for external facing, right? B2B partners coming in, other, right, NIH with other healthcare organizations, with research and education organizations, and making it easier for all of, they say, everyone to rise up together and pull off what's going to be a tremendous success.
I want to pivot to a topic that, Grant, I know is close to your heart. How can agencies have confidence in the security of their identity infrastructure, and how important are agency tech decisions here?
Yeah, let me speak a little bit to this. I mean, I think this is a really critical topic. It's sort of, we talked about SolarWinds, we talked about other things. People have been living with, insecure infrastructure vulnerabilities in all of their systems, but insecure identity infrastructure is really a vehicle to access, large swaths of data. Historically, maybe it was more of an insider issue because the bad people aren't on our network, but increasingly we're sort of said, hey, that's probably not true. It's probably not been true for a while. So, the identity infrastructure is really on the front line of keeping both bad people, like, and insider, misuse of systems off of accessing important data. So, I mean, I think, how do you do this? Make sure that your logs from your identity infrastructure are going into security operations processes. Make sure you have robust detection, monitoring capabilities here. I personally think, and administration policy is really advocating for leaning into what, cloud service providers can offer. Cloud is an interesting space in identity. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of adoption of managed services in that space. It offers some benefit because, for example, patching, right? They can patch their infrastructure, very quickly. There's usually robust, security operations and monitoring teams, things of that nature. Obviously, there's somewhat lack of a reduced visibility. You are taking some risk transfer in the shared responsibility model to your CSP. So you need to have confidence that your CSP and their providers, if they have any, are people who you have confidence in their processes. We try and address some of that through FedRAMP, but ultimately it's something that people have to have their own confidence in. But I do think, on net, for many organizations, especially those without robust internal capabilities, cloud offers a very powerful tool for improving the security of your identity infrastructure. And then certainly, I think identity governance is another critical element of this. Make sure that you really have identity governance capabilities in place, that you're actioning on them. and make sure you've done this sort of, threat modeling, right? I mean, there's a lot of paperwork in the government cybersecurity ecosystem that we all fill out. I think, make that paperwork do its job, which is to ultimately assess the security of the systems, the boundaries, the relationships between them. I think that, it's not just about making sure that, your OIG doesn't ding you for not implementing this 853 control. It's really about trying to make sure that you understand the trust model that you're creating with your infrastructure, and that the compromises that you're taking to make things work are compromises you're comfortable with. And I think that really trying to make sure you have the staff and the capabilities to do that. It's not easy, right? It's very hard. It's very time consuming. But this is one of the most important systems in any agency, and it really deserves that level of investment and focus to really make sure that you're doing it right. So that's what I would say.
Matt, thoughts?
Grant's killing it. Like, it's hard to follow up. I guess the biggest thing for me also, and this is something that every agency we worked with, we struggle with, is right, focus on the standards of the integrations and following, right? For example, if you're doing single sign-on and internal federation to your applications, right? You're going to use SAML and you're going to use OpenID Connect, right? One of those two are going to be what every user in a browser is connecting to an application. And if that application doesn't support those things, put a proxy, put something in front that will support those standards, right? Same thing with pushing attributes or pulling attributes to your SaaS providers, right? Grant talked about identity governance. That connector, if you can prevent it, should not be a direct connector to the APIs. You should be using that vendor's SCIM interface if they have it, right? Or using your assertions in your SAML or OIDC call to provide those attributes. Right? Focus on those standards and using standards-based interfaces rather than what your vendor from whatever your identity provider is, their proprietary piece, because that will allow us to grow faster in the future, right? There's a lot of emerging standards that are being built on top of those standards that will enable the security infrastructure to come back. One of the things I'm most excited about is security event IDs, risk, CAPE, CAEP, right? Those are all built on these existing SAML, OpenID Connect, JOT, SCIM interfaces that if we have these pieces in place, we're going to come together with a super tight security infrastructure very, very fast to prevent the lateral movement, to be able to have the context data to make better decisions. And I mean, maybe we'll even be able to drop authenticator levels because we have more trust in other things because of those.
All right, let's pull up the last poll question. What challenges are impacting your organization in implementing Pivot CAC cards? Funding for the hardware, software, training personnel on the cards readers, dismantling, modernizing legacy systems to comply with these cards, administrative issues with maintaining the cards, replacing troubleshooting cards and readers, other, or you've already implemented them. All right, let's see the responses there. All right, so by and large, dismantling, modernizing legacy systems to comply with the cards. And then the second biggest category is already implemented. And then we got a tie between funding and other. So does that check out with what you see, Matt?
We see a lot of already implemented. I'll be honest, I even hate that question, period. And I think that is a major part of the reason we're in the situation we are with identity today, right? PIV CAC is freaking awesome, right? From an authentication, trust, right, perspective, mutual TLS, establishing those sessions. I know who's behind that keyboard. But the way we've implemented it with a lot of those legacy systems with direct authentication to their front door prevents us from moving on to additional credentials and factors. And that trust is all over the place, because how many of those endpoints don't actually look up the revocation list or call the OCSP as they've been integrated? So even though I might have a revoked cert, because that was a signed cert that was good at some point, I'm still getting to those apps. So to me, right, all of that legacy integration problem, because people are trying to use PIV X509 authentication directly, shouldn't be a problem, because I would guarantee 90% of those systems support SAML, OIDC, or a header variable whereby you can put a proxy directly on that same device, do the good way of authenticating, and then give them the value that app expects. And then we allow our IDP, right, our identity provider, to decide what's the right level of credential based on the risk to access that app. And I know I took it off course of what the question was, but right, the number one thing was that integration problem. Let's move that problem back to the place that should be making that decision for the entire organization, the one place we define trust for authentication for all web-based applications, and sometimes more than web-based applications, right? And make the flexibility there, and then our trust to the applications just got a whole lot easier. So sorry for taking it off the rails, but but right, I've seen that pattern hold us back so many times, because the credential, right, the person's identity is tied to that one credential. And as we're moving out, that is preventing so many other things from moving forward. So I just have to scream to break the pattern anytime I can.
I mean, I would agree with that. I would only add one thing, which is if there's one takeaway here, which is, you know, for everyone who is steeped in, you know, 863.2 and FIPS 201.2 and 1, you know, read the new versions of those documents, you know, and sort of think about what they're trying to say, which is that the card is not the identity. The identity is distinct from the card, and the card is a credential that authenticates with that identity. And there is a possibility of other credentials, whether they're PKI based or non-PKI based, that also authenticate with that identity. And that is a huge change in the progression of thinking of government identity in the last 3 or 4 years, really coming out of the failures, I would argue, after OPM, to really lean into this stuff at a reasonable cost. And so I would agree with everything Matt said. The only other thing I'd say is, you know, stop counting the number of times you issue a PIV card and say you're done with PIV, and focus on the integrations between your identity provider and your applications to decide whether you really have reached that strong MFA bar. Because that's ultimately what matters, is protecting access to the systems and the data at the end of the day.
I want to close with a question for both of you. Just what's next in terms of Grant, you mentioned guidance that's forthcoming that will further solidify that transition that you've been talking about. And Matt, I'm also curious from your perspective, you mentioned some things you're excited about. So what are you hoping to see on the horizon?
Grant, you want to take the
yeah, sure. I'll go first. Yeah. So look, I mean, we're everyone always asks me, you know, when is the System Zero Trust maturity model coming out? The answer is we're working on it, right? So there's additional guidance, you know, final versions of things we've already published, new documents. You know, we're continuing to look at the, you know, the space here. What are opportunities for us to, you know, offer, like, partner with others, you know, do kind of shared services, you know, continue to work with agencies to help provide what they need to get this stuff implemented. So more to come on that front. You know, in our other stakeholders, we've recently published some guidance, excuse me, on small businesses and like strategies for small businesses to improve their cybersecurity. I think a lot of that applies to small and micro agencies. So I would encourage small and micros to take a look at that guidance and some of the concepts that it is, you know, speaking to. Some of it is about identity.
So yeah, continued, trying to do those kinds of things, assessments of agency systems. We're always here. We're happy to support. We've done a number of cyber stats about identity recently. We'll continue to do more in the relevant areas going forward.
Yeah. So, and then I'll jump on the second half of that. So, right, outside of CISA's work, I think, right, there's going to be, we saw the early updates to FIPS this year. There's going to be a new derived credentials document coming out this year. So all the NIST docs are being refreshed in identity right now too, right? New derived credentials documents coming out, new 863 documents. And one of the things I'm excited about is, for the first time ever, a real dedicated document on guidance around federation, right? Not only between agencies, which I will say is in most cases rare to find, right? Today we're getting better, but right, what is the guidance on what federation looks like between agencies, from the outside industry partners to federal agencies, as well as citizens in? So those are super exciting, because those are going to set the next decade of identity standards and patterns that we're going to follow. And then from a, what's exciting to me, right, this continued bringing together of security and identity, and the world's really coming together, right? I think a lot of organizations don't realize how much trust they've put into the SaaS providers that they have signed up with. And if I start my session for the day and then go over to just Salesforce, ServiceNow, pick your favorite SaaS provider, right? I'm not picking on anyone specifically, but right, I can authenticate, and I've got a session with them for the next 12 hours. Well, or weeks, depending on how that configuration is. There's nothing today in most cases that will tell me if they think one of my people is doing something bad. So some of the new standards around CAPE, right, continuous authentication, or authorization, security event ID. So if a credential changes, if they see that my person has moved to a new network, or the Starbucks down the street, right, it's going to have ways for us to, as an identity provider, the owner of that identity, say, if they're at the Starbucks and they're not on our zero trust network, whether that's a VPN or a new SASE, right, service, we're going to make you enforce policy that says they get less data because they're in a more risky place, or if they're in a different country, right? That bidirectional is going to be really powerful for all of us moving forward. And that's right, that's big stuff. That's probably 5+ years down the path, but seeing everything line up today, that when all of that comes together, I can't wait to watch the red teamers and see how they're going to change their tactics and hopefully move on to somebody else as their control point instead of us at identity, because we locked them out.
We can only hope. Thanks so much. That's a great note to end on. I want to thank you both for joining me today. It's been a great conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you to the audience for some great questions. I'll flip it back over to Alyssa.
Great. Thank you guys so much. That was a great panel. Before everyone heads out, I do want to encourage everyone to fill out one final polling question so that you're eligible for CPE credits. We'll send it right to your email. So if you did fill out all 6 polling questions, like I said, we'll send you that polling credit right to your email. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today, but we did want to thank our partners again over at Ping Identity for partnering with us today, and to our amazing panelists, moderators, and Keynote. We'd also like to thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next event. And have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.